Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason Van Schie, and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Joelle Mitchell. How are you today, Joelle?
So, Jason, just to give our guests a little bit of context, what for them was many episodes ago, I stated that I was about to move back into temporary accommodation. Today is Thursday. That episode for us was Monday of this week. So
it's about a month between episodes.
About
3 days.
About that, but 3 days for us. Yeah. So I'm still about to move into temporary accommodation. So we've got somebody coming to help us move tomorrow. So we'll get in there tomorrow and we'll have hopefully a nice weekend in an apartment that isn't just full of clutter and nonsense. So I'm looking forward to that with a nice view over the river.
And if you had to be violently optimistic, I know that's against your nature, but if you had to be, how long do you think you're going to be in temporary accommodation for?
So part of the reason that we're in temporary accommodation is because the insurance company has agreed that the new builder needs to do some exploration works to understand the scope of rectification work that still needs to be done. So it really depends on what they find. Yeah.
Okay.
So there was a whole wall that was like a conduit for water from our storeroom upstairs through into the roof or the ceiling of the apartment that was downstairs from us, and nobody did anything with that. So all of the insulation inside that wall got completely soaked, and nobody's looked at that at all. So that's going to be a big factor in terms of like what they find in there and what they decide to do with that. So at this stage, I'm going to say I don't know.
Yeah.
And my estimate will be pending the results of the initial investigative works.
Okay, we'll tune in 2 months, everyone.
Yeah.
to find out what the estimate is going to be.
Oh, dear.
Oh, well, at least tomorrow you do the move, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So you'll be away from the clutter soon.
Yes.
Yeah. Step by step. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Oh, good.
Yep.
Well, look, we should probably introduce our guest.
Yes, we should.
She is waiting patiently for us. So look, our guest today hails from South Africa. I think she's the first South African we've actually had on the show, but she does now reside in England. She has formal qualifications in human resources and has expanded her skill set into employee wellbeing and psychological health and safety. She is the Wellbeing Business Partner Lead for Emcor UK. Welcome to the podcast, Hayley Farrell.
Thank you for having me, Jason and Joelle. It's great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you on. I did see you present around ISO 45003 with Peter Kelly on a webinar hosted by Life, and I thought, well, it'd be great to get you on and share, because you seem to be someone who really gets it.
Fantastic. Yes, it was an honor to present alongside Peter, and just really good to share the knowledge and just share best practice to help people along the journey, really.
Yeah, and we're really excited to hear that from you, someone who is working internally using the international standard as kind of a basis. So it'll be really interesting to hear from your learning so far today.
So before we get into that, do you have any podcasts that you like to listen to that you think our listeners would be interested in?
I do. In terms of I've got 4 here that actually aren't linked to psych health and safety, but are linked to wellbeing in general. So Fundamental Health by Paul Saladino, really good one. Feel Better, Live More by Dr. Rangan Chatterjee. On Purpose with Jay Chetty. And the last one is Diary of a CEO by Steve Bartlett. I don't know if you've read his book, but he wrote Happy Sexy Millionaire. And it's a really great book to put things in perspective in terms of a quote I love: if you don't make time for your wellness, you'll be forced to make time for your illness. So those are a couple of my podcasts and directions of travel in terms of what I like to listen to.
Good stuff.
What was the name of that? Happy Sexy Millionaire.
I was just thinking, is that your motto, like your goal in life?
Yeah, it might require a bit of facial reconstruction.
Well, once you're a millionaire, you can afford it.
Yeah, that's right.
You can get those pec implants.
Apparently, according to Peter Kelly, my shirts are too tight.
You're looking swollen enough as it is. You don't need them. Yeah. How inappropriate, Peter Kelly, objectifying Jason like that.
Always makes me feel really self-conscious.
Yeah. So, Hayley, can you tell us about your professional career, please?
Yes, of course. Thank you. So as Jason mentioned, grew up in South Africa, studied business commerce, specializing in human resources, moved across to the UK 6 years ago now. So career back home was in HR. Moving across here, started the journey again, was really fortunate to get into Emcor UK, which is facilities management. It's not an industry that you fall in, that you choose to go into, you kind of fall into it, and have been there since. Have grown internally within the recruitment and HR team, and then moved across as a wellbeing lead. Quite fascinating, because a lot of people ask me, why would you want to leave HR and kind of come straight out of it and specialize particularly in wellbeing? So a couple of years ago, I actually studied to be a personal trainer, and wanted to get out of corporate. And that's really, I think, where it sparked my interest in understanding the link between well-being and corporate, essentially. So your personal well-being, how that impacts everything that you do at work. And just really fortunate that Emcor decided to really make a role particular to leading a strategy. I think that's a really big, bold step. Also moving out of the HR department into wellbeing, sustainability and assurance, which encompasses risk, technical compliance, sustainability and environment, physical safety, or I suppose the more safety side of health and safety, and now wellbeing as well. So been quite a journey, but very people-centric.
Yeah, that's an interesting decision on the business's perspective, I guess, as you're saying there. So typically, like your wellbeing stuff tends to be a lot of the time incorporated into your human resources function. So it's interesting that they've taken that approach of actually separating out the wellbeing function and incorporating in the safety and risk stuff. I think that's a really unusual but positive step to take there.
I think it is unusual. I think it's definitely a step change in the right direction, in terms of my view of where mental health and wellbeing sits in an organization. Having been on the other side of HR and actively managing casework, employee relations, performance, it can sometimes be quite challenging to really put an employee's well-being ahead of something such as performance, capability, etc. And that's not saying that it can't be done, because absolutely it can be, but I think it's definitely about that education piece. I know later on in the conversation we're going to talk about leadership, which comes into line management, and I think it becomes really challenging to do them both together when it's completely within a people function. The other aspect of bringing it into traditional health and safety space and alongside risk is the conversation we're having today is around the psychosocial risks and creating parity between that traditional safety space and now this mental health and well-being safety. So I think when we think about it, working alongside risk assurance as well in the business, as well as sustainability, well-being is not something that is a tick box exercise. It's something that we want to do for life. So when we talk about sustainability, it's part of that narrative as well. Most businesses have people, even if they're selling an asset, people are such a huge asset. You want them to be healthy, well, have longevity and sustain the business. So it's a good place for us to be in at the moment, an exciting place.
So Hayley, tell us a bit about your experience of workplace mental health to date and where you see it's moving in the future.
So I started as a mental health and wellbeing champion, so mental health first aider, and a conversation which I think is quite challenging because you put a title first aid behind something and it I think it can create the thinking that you have to solution something, such as physical first aid. You could probably initiate CPR if needed to, where the mental health space can be a bit more challenging. That's where it kind of started, I think, in business in terms of mental health first aiders, well-being. Fruit bowls was something that was really common. You know, how do we make sure that everybody gets their 5 a day? Quite, I would say, a tactical intervention, something that would be delivered and you would hope people would engage, and that would then support their well-being. But moving into a much more systemic, I suppose, approach is where I see, well, this new standard is taking us into, but it's about really knowing how to apply it and understand that without getting the foundation right, so doing all the good things, such as even the basic things that are being done in business today, return to works, risk assessments, health surveillance, those are all the more reactive health areas. Well-being is the proactive, but you can't really do well-being in a proactive way properly if you don't have your foundation of return to works, well-being conversations, those risk assessments done correctly, because you're essentially building a house on sand. So I think that is the huge challenge for organizations at the moment, due to operational stretch, time. Do the basics right. Don't always jump into try and solution something by bringing something else in, or another program or another policy. Do the right thing. And I think that's where the 45,003 standard really helps, because it takes you through a journey of understanding, do you have those basics before jumping into the, perhaps, like I've mentioned, the proactive space. So in the UK, we've got 5 ways to well-being, which is something that is promoted by the NHS. It's be active, connect, give, take notice, keep learning. Those are all really positive, proactive, self-managed approaches to well-being. But I think it becomes really hard to expect self-management of an employee when their work environment isn't supportive of them leading that proactive lifestyle. So that's the kind of journey we've been on, is recognizing that we did some really great stuff. How do we elevate that and keep the good stuff going? But let's take a couple of steps back and look into the things that maybe need refinement. There needs to be some more education, more awareness, and really get that right. And then we can build on the proactive, but let's refocus type thing, is where I think we've moved to. And organizations, whether you're starting out on the journey, it's a really good place to start, because start with the basics. It's like, I used to play a lot of hockey and I used to coach hockey. Go back to basics, don't try and do fancy tricks. Push well, stop well, do those things correctly, and then we can learn the skill set beyond that.
Yeah, no, that's really good advice for life, I think. My wife's a basketball coach herself, and yeah, big focus on the fundamentals. You mentioned something interesting around the 5 ways to well-being. One of them is to take notice, and Pete's going to love how much we're quoting him today. But he did say something like, you don't want employees to be more mindful if work sucks, because then they're going to notice. So before we start adding on these well-being activities or self-help kind of self-care strategies, what you're saying, and obviously the focus of ISO 45003 is let's fix the systemic issues, the work environment issues, before we start making people responsible for putting up, like making themselves or keeping well, in spite of the challenges of work. But speaking of the international standard, obviously it's early days. The final version only came out in June of this year. It has been in draft format well before that, so many companies were starting to read it and think about how they might start adopting it. In these early days, how have you seen other companies potentially look at the standard and start making steps towards adoption of it?
I think you've mentioned it is still early days. So there's something that you guys have done brilliantly is that education piece. I think that was really something that was lacking in the market, and probably still is people understanding what it means. So some organizations don't even have ISO 45001. So ISO in general can be something that people aren't au fait with or knowledgeable about. So understanding what it is, and also understanding that it is a piece of paper with a lot of really good guidance in it. It doesn't mean you need to apply the entire standard to your organization. That can be really, really overwhelming. And don't get me wrong, when I first did it and looked at the gap analysis and thought, oh my goodness, I was pretty critical and thought, no. And then I went back and had to kind of reassess and think, what's the low-hanging fruit, but what's the most meaningful? I think that whole piece around take notice. You've got to do it authentically. This has to be something that you're going to absolutely hang your hat on, because the last thing you want to do is say, we've adopted ISO 45003, or we are in the process of adopting, yet you've got systemic behavioral things in an organization that need to be addressed. And I think that's where leadership comes in, understanding of why it's important. We talk around metrics such as decrease absenteeism, decrease presenteeism, other things such as a proactive approach to using occupational health, but it's more than just the metrics. It's how are we supporting economic, societal, and environmental growth? How are we making an impact by the work we're doing? Because essentially, it's not just for the people we've got now, it's for future generations to come as well. So you've really got to address those issues. I don't want to say issues because it can be quite a harsh term, but yeah, I think that take notice piece and making sure that it's authentic is really important. In terms of other organizations, I suppose, adopting it at the moment, I think very early stages, people are understanding how, what, and by sharing this knowledge, I think really helps, because you don't have to make the same mistake. Not that it's a mistake, but know where to start rather than keep it all very close to your chest. Because well-being, as I've mentioned, is an unnavigated platform. There's so many areas that you can go down, and there's no right and wrong. But being able to know that there's people around you who've either tried it is a really helpful system to lean into.
Absolutely. I get asked quite frequently these days, can you point to a company or to an industry that is doing this particularly well? But like you say, it's kind of a new framework for many, even though there have been professionals working in this space for decades. It's not something that's been adopted much at all by organizations. So taking that more systemic approach, risk-based approach is new, and the standards obviously new. So I guess it'll be a bit of watch this space and see how the companies start to tackle it.
So obviously ISO 45003 really highlights the need to move workplace mental health outside of that typical view of it being a HR issue and moving it fairly heavily into the remit of health and safety. And you've talked about how your company has sort of created this separate role that actually does that. Can you talk a little bit more about the role, and do you sort of have a group of people that you work with there, or is it just you? And what does that look like for you in your company?
So I think importantly is wellbeing has been noticed at enterprise level. So at the board level is where it's kind of been picked up as a strategic objective. And this was the decision to take it out of the HR space and align it with traditional health and safety. The department, as mentioned, has got a technical compliance, it's got assurance, risk, sustainability and environment, traditional safety operations, and then this well-being and health area. So underneath there, we've got people who work in a more operational space and will be out in the field, kind of speaking to the teams, doing risk assessments, checking the technical compliance. Having brought well-being into this space, it's my view that there is as we've spoken about systemic behavior, but there's root cause. There's a link between all of these. And if we can start to understand it by looking at our data and looking at where some of these hotspots might be, we can focus our attention on areas, not individuals, because I think this standard really talks into the behaviors and the business or the systemic environment. It might not be 4,500 employees, it might be 100 on a specific contract in a specific area, but that is the point. It doesn't mean that because one person's been off with stress and mental health, that one person has got the problem, and how do we make reasonable adjustments to support that individual? What's going on in the wider business context? And that for me is where placing well-being alongside these other areas helps us get to root cause, because are there other things happening? Has there been incidents or accidents or near misses, for example? Is there anything in terms of non-compliance from a technical perspective? And then bringing in the HR metrics, so the absenteeism, and really amplifying that. So I think what's really helpful with these psychosocial risks is it helps us to understand the so what, because we know somebody's gone off sick with stress and mental health, but why? We don't always ask those questions. Even if they come back into the workplace, we might do a stress questionnaire, but what framework is in place to really get to that root cause area? So by positioning the wellbeing role alongside safety operations, it helps us to start think about these types of things and this type of narrative, rather than the traditional, we'll just refer to occupational health, or we'll just refer them to the EAP and that will solution the problem. We're not really addressing that root cause, which is something in a safety space people are brilliant at, because people have the right to come to work safely and leave safely from a physical perspective, but these mental risks have been masked, I think, in the past, or people don't really know how to deal with them or why we should deal with them. So yeah, the new way that we're working has really supported. You did, sorry, Joelle, also ask about who else is in the business. So we've got mental health aware champions and wellbeing champions who support the local development and driving of wellbeing and mental health at site levels, because we are quite a distributed workforce.
Yeah, so that's you've made a number of interesting points there. I think one that I want to draw on a little bit is that, yeah, historically, if someone does end up with a psychological injury as a result of work, you know, that will get probably referred to the injury management team. And, you know, your health and safety team are potentially not even informed about that, and it's not recorded as a, you know, as a recordable incident or as a lost time injury or anything like that. It's more that, you know, this person is unwell. I guess depending on whether they seek workers' compensation, but it might just be that they're taking extended time off, and it's not actually even recorded as a work-related injury. So yeah, I think that there's immense value in having that that function incorporated into, I guess, active collaboration with the traditional health and safety functions. But I think that also having that background in HR, you've got that also ability to know when you need to draw HR in to those conversations and scenarios. And one of the things that we talk about quite a lot is the importance of collaboration between functions. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yes, thank you. Collaboration and integration is so important for us, because that's about the enablers, really, of how's this really going to be meaningful across the business. And it's something that personally, I think we talk about well-being and we talk about mental health, and they become quite binary. They become in a box, on a shelf. We know we need to deal with it. There's a stress policy, there's a procedure that we follow, but only when it's been identified. And to your point, it might sit specifically in an HR space. The challenge is, how do we communicate? Now, don't get me wrong, it's probably one of the biggest challenges, because things like GDPR, where do we put it? Where do we store it? How do we know who to get involved when? It's not always straightforward. But taking it off that shelf and out of that box and not seeing it separate to equality, diversity, and inclusion, because I don't see how you can have mental health and well-being without having those conversations around potentially mental health in the BAME sector. You know, they are all so integrated. So we have got leadership teams where there are these key individuals who are involved in regular discussions around the business, whether it be ED&I, sustainability, operations, HR, and the people metrics side of things, to make sure that these are brought to the forefront of conversations, so that we can really start to be more collaborative. As I've mentioned, it is difficult because it's a whole change process. It's a change of mindset. It doesn't happen overnight, but starting to have the conversations and starting to link everything, I think, is imperative to really embedding something like this framework, because whilst it is specific to the psychosocial risks, I personally view it as a complete culture change for many organizations. It's about culture, changing behavior. What does it actually mean? So we talk about going back to your values or your purpose, but what does that mean in day-to-day behavior? I think is how you will get this right. And that can only be done in an integrated approach.
Yeah, you make some excellent points there. It does absolutely need to be an integrated approach, and it needs to be fit for purpose for the values and the history of that business. And people need to be brought along on through that process. Absolutely.
Yeah, so there's some key challenges, obviously, in that, trying to make sure that we are inclusive and we do collaborate across functions, and we are thinking about the context of the organisation and developing something that is really bespoke to our company versus just something off the shelf. But what are some of the other potential key challenges in adopting a standard like ISO 45003? You've obviously done a fair bit of work investigating it to date and taking the early steps towards adopting the standard. So what are some of the things that you've identified?
I think a couple, in terms of making people understand where it sits. So if you've already adopted 45001, it can really integrate well into the management context of that standard that you've already got. It doesn't need to be something that's seen as really overwhelming if you've already got a framework. So try and weave it into existing systems. And I think I talk about that because policy is another challenge. In the traditional safety space, policy is followed by an arrangements document. So really, if you're talking health and safety, you should have one policy. Now, this standard says, give consideration as to whether there is a need for an additional psychological safety or psychosocial risk policy. Traditionally, people would argue, but it should be one policy. You can't have 3, 4, 5 different policies, but this can be quite bespoke. So you've really got to work and identify what works for the business and how you're going to elevate it, because it is important and it does just get lost if you don't emphasize it. Another challenge is a policy for policy's sake versus what does it actually mean. Don't have a policy if you don't have the how-to behind that. So if somebody really wants to use the policy, how do you use it? What tools are in place to mitigate or reduce the risk of harm? That understanding for me about reducing risk of harm, you can't prevent every single risk, but you can do a lot to reduce it. I think a lot of people, particularly when we talk about a line manager, it can be quite overwhelming to see something like this and think, how do I how do I mitigate every single risk? So we've got the 3 areas. We've got social factors, work environment, and then the more job design elements. Not everything is doable at once. So those challenges, I see that as a big challenge of the framework, is making sure people understand that you can't remove every single risk, but you can do a lot to reduce those risks and to start being able to talk about them, allowing people the space and without fear of retribution to be able to raise a risk, to say, this is bigger than just the one person who's gone off absent. So I think creating that environment is another key challenge.
Yeah, there's a couple of things there already that you've mentioned that I'd like to point out. So one is around the policy. Policies are so important, I feel, so that there's something that this hangs on. I've seen a lot of companies who've started to go, oh yeah, we're going to start doing psychosocial risk management. Let's start with the survey. I'm like, if you do this without actually having top management support and policy support behind it, this might be the only time you do it. Where's the continuous improvement? Where's the commitment to ongoing risk assessment and management of risk? So I really feel people shouldn't, skip that step. And as you said, there's a decision that needs to be made. Is it a standalone policy or is it a policy that sits within your broader OC health and safety policy? We have thought about this before and talked about it, and it seems to have more gravitas if it sits within your health and safety policy. But I take your point around, well, then it really needs to be communicated well, and it needs to be something that's not lost beyond in a bigger policy, right? The importance of this. One of the reasons we've spoken about it sitting within the OC health and safety policy is based on some recommendations that came out of the Boland review into the WHS Act here in Australia, where she said basically with the Act, we don't need a whole new Psychological Health and Safety Act. What we need to do is to upgrade the existing Act to incorporate more language around psychological health and safety and psychological injury. So I think that's probably the easiest step. And obviously, if you make a change to a policy, that needs to be communicated to employees. And that could be your chance to provide that communication around, this is the change that we've made and this is the reason why. And this is not just the policy, but these are the tools, as you say, which is the important bit that go along with the policy to actually make you to able to do this or enact this policy. So policy is a really interesting one. But again, companies need to think about their context and what's going to work for them.
Definitely. I think that understanding the internal and external issues, what is it about your business that needs greater support from a psychosocial risk perspective? And I think emotional intelligence always comes up for me because it's really holding a mirror up saying, what can we do better? What can we do to protect our employees and make sure that their job is good for them? And that we talk about the narrative, and I mentioned it again, they'll be more productive, there'll be less absenteeism. But I don't know if that's enough of a business case all the time. It's kind of the approach that we like to take is it's the right thing to do, and it will have an impact not only on the workplace, but on the community as well. There's a huge responsibility. It used to be called corporate social responsibility, but for organizations to do right by the employee and the community in which they work in. And it's a ripple effect because it's not just the people at work doing the job, it's them going homes and the lives that they live outside of work and the people that they impact as well. So being really, or having that emotional intelligence, I think is really important in understanding the context of your business.
Yeah, absolutely. When talking about, getting top management support and strategic buy-in, then you need to think about what's important for the business. And look, the ROI discussion and, even the legislated requirement in the UK, there is a clear legal requirement, as in Australia, that companies need to create healthy and safe work environments. And that extends beyond the physical health and safety of employees to also the psychological health and safety of employees. But the ROI business case, the legal business case doesn't seem to have moved the needle. So I think the CSR one and sustainability and ESG is something that is really high up on board agendas at the moment. So, shareholders are holding companies to account who are not creating good working conditions for their employees. There's some good examples lately in the UK. There was one that just came out in the Fin Review in the last couple of days in Australia of another big company that, there are people who are coming out and saying, no, it is not a good place to work. The expectations are completely unreasonable. It is having psychological health impacts on employees, and shareholders are voting with their feet. And so this is actually probably a good time to plug our upcoming live panel on the 7th of September, which will come out, I think, a week after this episode will, where we'll be talking about that social impact business case for psychological health and safety. Before I let Joelle ask the next question on the agenda, there was one other thing that you mentioned as well, which was around the low-hanging fruit. When I'm sure for many companies, if they've never done this before, when they do their first risk assessment of psychosocial hazards, there's probably going to be a number of things that they identify, right? And it could probably be quite overwhelming when you look at the list of things that they need to improve. To go, well, we can't do all of these things. Maybe we just don't do any. Or maybe we don't ask because we know there's going to be too many things. And so we won't even do a risk assessment because they don't want to open Pandora's box. And to that end, like you're saying, it's about the low-hanging fruit. Start with the things that, the 2 or 3 things that you can, do quickly, cheaply with like limited resources, do those things. That will help you to get buy-in from employees and line managers and all the rest to show, hey, look, this isn't that hard. We've just identified some risks. We've done something about them. You don't have to tick off all of the risks straight away. ISO 45003 is very much about the plan, do, check, act model, continuous improvement. So let's do a few of these things and then we'll come back and we'll tick off some more things the next time around. It's not an expectation. You do a risk assessment, you put in controls, and then you become the most mentally healthy organization overnight. This is something that happens over, in most cases, many years.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's not overnight. Do what I always say, if people would just communicate, we could probably resolve a lot of these issues. And giving people a framework, for example, something that really helps is developing a well-being conversation framework within your organization that will enable people to start to talk about some of these issues. So even if you've done a risk assessment and you've assessed that there's ambiguity in the job role, there is lack of clear purpose, how are you facilitating these conversations? You might get that feedback in an engagement survey or in a risk assessment, but so what? What are you doing to support that conversation? Or is well-being a competency that you want people who are looking for role progression to start to have as part of their skill set? It's not just about the technical skills. Are there some softer skills that need some development? So there's some of those things that I think that you can implement, and doing one of them really well rather than doing 6, 7, 8 of them half-heartedly and not making that change is where I think that low-hanging fruit really comes to fruition.
That's right. I mean, it's the whole idea that, you can have one control that addresses multiple hazards. You don't need a single control for, 7 different hazards, as you say. And doing one control really well could address a number of different things. Yeah, for sure.
So I guess one of the common themes that's coming through all of this is the importance of having leadership involved and committed, and that's not only about bringing people along on the ride, on the journey. It's also about sustainability. It's also about appropriate allocation of resources to support implementation. A whole raft of things there. So given how significant leadership commitment is to the success of these processes, how do you tell when you've got it?
Great question. And I think one of the biggest challenges for businesses is to do that authentically, because the leadership have it as a strategic objective, but how does that really grow legs in the business? How are you role modeling those behaviors? Something that comes up often is working hours and schedule, which is a risk. Working long hours, replying to emails after a certain time, what framework have you got in a business to say that's not how we act, that's not how we behave, and how are you role modeling that? So I think how do you know you've got it is when you've got leaders up the chain or really across the board. I think it's really important to it shouldn't only sit at the executive director table. It should sit at the level below that and the level below that. There shouldn't be a gap. There shouldn't be somebody missing, because that kind of shows that there isn't that clear communication or clear direction of travel. So when across the board, you've got representation at certain events or certain campaigns that you're rolling out within a business, or people are starting to talk about it, I think is when you know you have got it. Challenge being operational stretch. I think a lot of operational people will struggle with time being a resource. How do I need to send that email, or I haven't had the time to get through my workload today, so I need to get it done this evening because tomorrow is going to be more pressurizing, more demanding. So I think those are always the challenges, is time and money to extend if you need people because the job demand is too much, which I think are probably two of the biggest challenges that support the authenticity of something like this. Because it's all good and well saying that you've got it, but unless you've got that backing and you're going to step back and say, there is no way we can decrease the demands of the job role without an additional headcount, we need to find the money, are you just going to continue to expose that individual to that risk ongoing until they end up burning out and leave? So yeah, I think leaders need to lead by example, be those role models, and have those conversations and really get to know what those risks are, and allow people to talk about them and share with them their own risks in terms of what's impacting their lives. And there's a whole piece around storytelling, which I don't really think fits directly into this. I think it's an important part of mental health and well-being because it creates a narrative, but it looks at it's okay not to be okay, which absolutely, but it's so much more than that. It's not just about sharing your mental health journey. It's about sharing and talking about the workplace and the impact and the effect it's having on you, even if you are an executive director. We're all only human at the end of the day. We can all only take so much.
Yeah, lots of interesting points there. I think the one of sort of, working in the evenings and, sending out emails at midnight and that sort of thing is probably something that, lots of people around the world are still grappling with, as the lines between work and home have become non-existent for many people.
I actually on that, I remember when you first started here, Joelle, and you're like, oh, should I put my email on my phone? I'm like, do you really want to do that?
Well, having spent 9 years in government where I just didn't, I couldn't, I'm quite happy that I've continued to not have my email on my phone. So I'm perfectly happy with that. And leaving my computer here when I'm on leave and not bringing it home with me.
Sometimes not bringing it to work either.
Well, that was an accident. Yeah, that wasn't the best. It wasn't my best moment, but that's all right.
That's a good idea for work-life balance. Actually, don't bring your computer to work.
Well, not if it means that you're an extra hour, late actually getting started on your working day, because that's not so great.
You got to chill in your car. It was
Sure,
Monday morning, wasn't it? And no one likes Joelle on Monday morning.
Well, I mean, no one likes Joelle, period, but especially not on Monday morning.
Uncaffeinated Monday morning.
Yeah,
It's the worst Joelle.
It is.
It's not your best life.
No. But yeah, thanks for distracting me from my point.
Oh, sorry, I have no idea what point you're going to make.
Yeah, I can see
Leading
that.
by example?
Yeah.
Was it?
Yes. So the point that I was going to make is if you're a leader and I guess, there are times where you do feel like you just need to get this stuff out of your brain. And if it's an email or whatever it might be, draft it, get it ready to go. Don't send it at 11 o'clock at night, because that sets an expectation across your team that that's what's expected in terms of performance and delivery and meeting targets. So if that's something that you need to do so that you can sleep and not be awake thinking about and trying, your brain keeping you awake, trying to remember this thing that you need to do in the morning, fine, do it. But, schedule the email to send at, a reasonable time in the morning once it's actually inside of business hours. So you can do that work without actually, I guess, setting that that example that you don't want your team to be following in terms of doing work at midnight. And I guess the other part of that is embracing that opportunity for flexibility where it exists, and letting people actually decide if they are working from home, what are the hours of the day that best suit them for working, and having those periods of time blocked out in their calendar where, okay, I'm not working during this period of time, I'm not going to be responding to emails, etc., and that actually being permissible, not only permissible but actually expected, that you're going to have periods of time in every 24 hours where you're not available, and making it clear, sort of when those periods of time are.
And I think you've touched on it already, Hayley, that clear communication, that solves a lot of issues. So if we can communicate, even if Jason decides that he needs to get an email off at 11 p.m, that Joelle knows that there is no expectation that she's working those sort of hours as well, because I don't pay her enough to do that.
Jason knows that Joelle has no expectation of working those hours, but
yeah, absolutely
not everybody has the work environment that we do, Jason.
That's right. Yeah, people could aspire though.
Yeah, sucks to be them.
I do think though that that's a really interesting point, because we talk a lot about, I think, in the world of lead by example, and email is one. I mean, I've just said it because it's something that's easy to go to, don't send an email. But that's not the only answer. We can't just have line managers or exec directors or saying, okay, after 6, I'm not going to send an email. And if, like you've said, if that works for them, that works for them. It's that clear expectation, but it's so much more than that. And I think it's, when you asked what shows that leaders are doing well, the authenticity in having a conversation and the honesty and the trust. I can't resolve this risk. I know your workload is excessive right now. I am looking into it, but then actually look into it. And I think that's when you know that it's working, is when the conversations on the ground are positive, not why do you have a wellbeing program when we're under-resourced and understaffed and nobody really cares? And I think that's when you know, is when those kind of feedback routes marry up, because you can have a menopause policy, you can, have a bunch of benefits that will support the living active, living a healthy lifestyle. But if you don't have that communication with the line manager or that authenticity again, it's not going to work. And for me, that's huge, because even if a line manager does not send an email, the damage can sometimes already be done if that conversation isn't open and that channel of, we can't resolve it, but we can work on it together. It might not be 8 weeks, but don't overpromise. I mean, overpromise and underdeliver either. Oh yeah, it's sorted for you in 2 weeks' time. And then the poor employee or team of employees is still struggling 2 months later because there's a lack of resource. So for me, it always goes back to that. The email is a quick win. It's a nice to have, but what is the root cause of the problem?
Yeah, and I think really what you're talking about there as well is creating trust with your team as a line manager, that, if you say you're going to do something and you can't do it, you come back to them and say, look, I know that this is what we've agreed to, but this is the situation and this is why I haven't been able to do it and this is what I'm now looking into. So, from an employee perspective, you might not really be happy with that solution, but you're a hell of a lot happier that your supervisors actually come and had that frank conversation with you, and they are actually creating that situation where where you do have trust that they're going to keep you informed about what's going on and that they are doing the best that they can to advocate for you, recognizing what the limitations are for them in their role as well.
Yeah. One of the things that really struck me, Hayley, is that Emcor in the UK there have actually, given you this as part of your portfolio and have resourced this properly, right? And I think that was one of the things when I thought about, well, how do you know if you've got top management support? Well, if they're actually going, well, this is a priority for us, and it's not just something we're going to say that we want to do, we're actually going to get a resource in our company to have this as one of their primary focuses. So it's amazing that Emcor's done that, and they've realized early that they need to resource this correctly, and it's not just going to happen, someone's just going to pick it up and it's poof, we've adopted this standard. What would you suggest to listeners who are yet to obtain that level of support, and maybe even top management is saying, yeah, we want to do this, but they don't feel like they've got the time or resources to be able to do it effectively?
I actually had a fellow ambassador reach out to me and ask me that exact question. How do we get the business case together to get a resource, or to even start with 45,003? So a couple of things. I would say, depending on the country's framework. So there's nothing legal at the moment. As we know, the standard isn't a legal requirement. I absolutely think we'll start to see some legality around it, which I think would be really helpful. But things like the Thriving at Work report and the mental health at work commitment, they give you some really clear standards as to what good looks like and what should be done. That's a really good starting point, because even if you don't have a resource, if the department only has one day to dedicate to this kind of thing, how many of those points or kind of charter areas are you actually being able to focus and deliver on? So I think identifying those challenges and what you can or are currently delivering on and where those gaps are really helps build that business case, because a lot of, in terms of talent retention and talent attraction, if we aren't doing some of these good things and making the environment a good place to work, you're going to struggle to get new people in and struggle to hold on to those people as well. 27500 is another ISO standard, and it's all around the human-centered organization. And that's another great standard to start to understand that human beings are at the center of everything that we do, and how do we create our work around them as an asset. And that was a great tool for us to start thinking as a prelude to 45,003 as well. So I would say using those assets to understand where you are as a business and also where you want to go, because I think you're right, Jason. It's great if a business puts a resource in that position, but it again just goes back to, what is the strategic objective? You can put 5 people in that role, but why? Is it to show the employees that you've got 5 people in the role looking after your well-being, or is it because you're open to looking at the gaps and really making the change? So I think understanding what's important to the business and is it to make that authentic change or not is really key, because I think anybody in that role will struggle it'll be misaligned. Does that make sense? If I'm passionate about mental health and well-being, it's got to be aligned to the work that I'm doing so that I can authentically support those employees. The business doesn't back that, it can be a really challenging place for any individual or team to be operating in, whether it be your 130 mental health and well-being champions out in the field. You've got to have that clear direction.
Yeah, I had to give that advice to someone working in the field recently, where she really wanted to do this and do it the right way, but she wasn't getting top management support, and it just became apparent over time that she never was going to. And so the advice was, look for someone else to work for, because it's just going to burn you out as a caring person, a wellbeing professional who's really, wanting to improve the lives of other people. If you're just not getting the support to do that internally, then it's better off finding a company that is actually legitimately interested in that.
And she did, didn't she?
She did. Good on you.
So I think, a lot of what we've been talking about today is, you've talked about sort of developing this culture within an organization of wellbeing. Lots of organizations will tend to just default to, implementing a wellbeing app or some other type of intervention like that. Can you talk about really what the differences are between those two approaches?
Yes. So I think there's so many apps out there, and if you look at a strategy, I think you need to be mindful of the role self-management of health and well-being plays, and employer support or line manager support, because you need to educate and aware people, make people aware about things that are out there. But there are a lot of apps that are out there for free. There's a lot of stuff that you can do to support your mental health and well-being. Everything in life is a choice. If that's what you believe is going to help you, and you start to educate people to go down that path. I think the challenge or the limitation comes into place when an organization thinks that they can pay a lot of money for an app and it's going to help employees become more mindful, become more aware of what those stress triggers are, remind them to take a walk, remind them to drink a glass of water, to stand up. But having past experience, it's hard enough to get people to use a work app, let alone remind them to use an app to stand up and go for a walk, if it's not something that they would be interested in. So you ticking a box by implementing an app and say, right, we've got this app, it's wonderful, everybody has access to it, so they should be fine. And I think for me, it goes back to that workplace culture. If you don't create the culture that educates, makes them aware, and why they should use the app, they won't use the app. But also don't have the app if their line managers are not giving them the space to be heard. They don't have support or personal development. There's an imbalance of reward. There's a lot of other issues at work that an app isn't going to resolve. So for me, it's not that I'm not a fan of apps. I just don't think that they should be the solution. I think it's great to have the proactive, but if you haven't resolved the groundwork, I think it's just a bit of a tick box exercise to say, yeah, we've got the app, everybody should be fine.
But Hayley, the app is just so much easier. Like, we could just pay for a subscription and then we're done.
Yes. You're saying?
No, I'm obviously being facetious because that's my middle name.
But that's what the world is like. And I think that's the challenge for people who really want to make a difference and really do care about change. Is yes, the app is there. The app is easy. I've done it. I can just say I've spent a load of money and it's been resolved. But I'm sure you could probably recruit 3 or 4 other people that will take the pressure off people rather than just roll out an app. My view.
And if we were, again, to make the comparison into physical safety, if you were to implement a control for a physical safety hazard, and then you made that control voluntary for people, and you didn't do any monitoring, you didn't do any follow-up to make sure that they were using it and that they were using it appropriately, and you didn't check that it was effective, that's not a control measure. And that's, these apps are implemented and then that's it. It's up to employees whether or not they want to use them, whether or not they want to engage with them. So no, it's not a control measure in any sense of the word.
Yeah, or the way that they're evaluated for effectiveness is how many people are actually logging in. There's a big difference between logging in and actually practicing self-care.
Well, and whether they're getting the outcomes from that as well. Is it actually having a measurable impact on outcomes for them?
Yeah.
And personally, it doesn't always work. I'm a huge fan of self-care, but if I'm feeling absolutely crap, the last thing I want to go and do is meditate. It doesn't always help in that time, so it's not going to solve all the problems. Sorry, I shouldn't have. But I think that's what's really frustrating is it's not one solution. Doesn't mean that the app is going to solve everything. I mean, there's a number of different types of self-care, conversations, communication. It's not just put on some earphones and, you're going to come out a new person in 20 minutes. It just doesn't work that way.
You've reminded me of a conversation. So as our listeners would be aware, in late last year, I experienced a bit of a catastrophe at home where my ceiling collapsed, and we had to respond fairly quickly, and it was all very stressful. And one of my colleagues in my previous job was, acting with empathy and in my best interests, and, suggested or reminded me that we had an EAP that I could access. And I said, well, I've just got too much on my plate at the moment, and, no amount of talking to a counsellor or doing meditation or anything like that is going to help me at the moment. I've literally just got too many things and not enough resources. And so it was, take some time off work and sort out what I need to sort out.
Yeah. I mean, you can provide employees all the supports that you want, but at some time you have to relieve the demands.
Yeah, absolutely. Too many demands and not enough resources. That's just mindfulness isn't going to help you in that situation.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Hayley, it's been a really fascinating discussion with you so far. Really interesting to hear, someone working on the inside of an organization who is, interested in ISO 45003 and not just, talking about the importance of it, actually doing it and having someone like yourself actually lead that, which is fantastic. So, given your experience to date in the employee wellbeing area and your new work around ISO 45003, looking into the future, what are your hopes for the future of workplace mental health?
I really hope that it becomes this integrated piece that we've spoken about, and it really becomes something that, I don't want to say that isn't something that's a fad or something that we speak about because the standard has come out and everybody thinks we need to do it. It becomes part of our day-to-day narrative and it's normal. And I think in 10, 15 years' time, it will be normal because the demographic coming through the doors, they will expect it to be part of life. And I wish we could click our fingers and it would happen now, because it would make things a lot easier in terms of being honest, being transparent, being able to really bring your true self or your whole self to work. So I just hope that it really does become this integrated piece of work and there is real sustainability in mental health and well-being. And there's been a lot of conversation around it, even pre-pandemic. I think we all know pandemic really brought it to the forefront. I don't want to see it become something that as life gets back to normal, it's not as important and people do tend to retreat and not share things like they have shared, through this virtual world that we've been able to, because we've all been the same size block on a screen. We haven't been in a big meeting room where you've got people who might be more senior in an organization. So I think the other thing would be fantastic if governments would start working together to simplify these kinds of things in terms of this framework is excellent, but making it usable across public sector, private sector, third sector, to make it one easy piece of work. And the reason I say this is because part of the Business for Health agenda is to increase life expectancy for up to 5 years for every single individual. But there's no framework around it. So there's a lot of people doing a lot of great work. But I think that if there was greater resource in pulling all of this stuff together, it would be an easier journey, if that makes sense for organizations. Because at the moment, if your organization has got a dedicated person and there is an understanding and a passion, it's great, but I don't think that there is enough of a legal requirement, and I don't think it should be you have to do it. But like Peter always says, and I'll quote him again, you know, measuring output stats anyway. You're measuring absenteeism, you're measuring all of that. Why not measure what you're putting in? Why not make it something that is mandatory? Because you're measuring somewhere along the line anyway. So yeah, I think the future of it for me has to be a bit more robust than it's nice to have.
Yeah. Yeah, the translation piece is so important. You know, there's lots of good information out there. There's obviously this standard, and you know, that's something that Joelle and I are passionate about, obviously. Like, how do we make this stuff actually able to be adopted by organizations rather than just something that looks nice on the shelf?
So do you have some words of advice for people who think that this is a field of work that they'd like to get into?
For me, I think if it aligns with you've got a personality and you want to make a difference, you know, do it. There's no right and wrong way of doing it. It is unknown territory, so it can be overwhelming, but every step forward, you learn something new, and it doesn't matter if, I think you won't make a mistake. You might just go in a different direction. And I think that's the world of mental health and well-being. Whether you're passionate about going into an industry like this, or even a line manager listening and wanting to do more, listen, be there, show up. And it's not instant gratification. Just because you've got the 45,003 standard and you've done the gap analysis, it's the plan, do, check, act. Keep going, keep doing, keep reviewing. It's not going to be a big done this, move on. So yeah, just keep showing up, I think, and it is challenging. I won't lie, because if you are passionate about it and you are leading it, it can be overwhelming. You can feel, I need to come up for air, you know, you can get really fogged down by all the other stuff going on. But I believe that it's for future generations. It's not just for the right here and right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent words of advice. Thank you.
Well, Hayley, it's been a fantastic chat. Like I said, we don't speak to enough people who are actually doing it, that are actually in the thick of it. So thank you so much for being willing to come on the podcast today and sharing some insights from someone who is actually starting to go through the rollout of the international standard.
Thank you for having me. It was wonderful to be here. Terrific.
Well, that brings us to the end of the show, listeners. So don't forget that if you want to catch the video as opposed to just listening to the podcast, you can do that on the Flourish TX YouTube channel. And if you don't like the long format, we do have some people who love listening to an hour plus of podcasts, but some people don't have that attention span. So we do on the Flourish TX LinkedIn page have the 2 to 4 minute video summaries of some of the key points that we get through with our guests. While you're in LinkedIn, then you can connect with Joelle and myself. We love to continue the conversation online with you all. So that's it, listeners. We'll catch you next episode.